I've been wanting to do this shot pretty much since the day I started vlogging through the 30-day shred. So the Apostle Paul and all of Paul's letters in like a day and a half. I did Romans and like the Corinthians and that kind of stuff, a big, huge long lap. I think that day there was 50 different chapters of the Bible to read. And then the next day I finished up the letters. And let me tell you, that was fun. That was interesting. I've talked about it before, and I'm not going to go into the chronological thing that much. But I'm willing to put this book in that I think that you need to read. This is N.T. Wright's biography of Paul, and it's written at like the normal folks level. I read it a few years ago, and I read it while I was in a chronological read of Paul. I'm going to put the link to that reading plan in my blog post about it. I think there might be a video. I can't remember, but I'm going to put all those, any necessary links are going to be in the show notes below. But what struck me this time, and I talked about it a little bit on the last video, is that we see theology being done. And it's different because in the Old Testament, we have deeply theological works. I think the Psalms is really theological. I think Deuteronomy is really theological. I think Leviticus is pretty theological. But we don't have anything in the Old Testament like we have Paul. And what's crazy is, and especially reading Acts and then reading all the rest of the Bible, within a really quick burst, we begin to see a bunch of how this happens. And what we lose when we read it without the chronological awareness is to understand the development of it. But with Paul, and like I talked about this in the video yesterday, you really see the beginning of the theological differences of the early church, about how they become concerned with a couple of things. They're concerned with circumcision. They're concerned with the inclusion of Gentile believers, because they're trying to figure out, how does this whole thing work? And you can look at Paul, how he's thinking through these things and how he's contextualizing this stuff in really unique ways. And like I talked about yesterday, in Acts, you see Paul's mission movement going forward. And then we also realize that, like the letter to Ephesians, like he was in Ephesus for 3 years, but the letter to Ephesians was written after that. And so the pastoral epistles, and I'm not going to include 1st and 2nd Corinthians in those. I know technically those are those, but to me, Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians really aren't that vain. But you look at Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, you really see Paul doing theological work amidst conflict and amidst people having to make these really big decisions. Because remember, to these folks, religion, it's not a matter of the afterlife. It's a decision-based framework of saying, this is how I believe the world works. And what I love about the Wright book and other books is they talk about, the big, huge shift on these early Christians, especially the Gentile Christian, because for some of them, this isn't just a decision of becoming from one God to another. Remember, they're not monotheists, they're polytheists, and they've got some tendencies. There's all sorts of interesting things. Alan Kreider's Patient Ferment of the Early Church, Rodney Stark's The Triumph of Christianity, Larry Hurtado's Destroyer of the Gods. Those are all really interesting sociological looks at the rapid rise of the early church. And if you're into Paul, if you're into Acts, if you're into those things, those are 3 books you need to check out. I'm going to put links to those down in the notes below here as well. So I'm reading all of these letters, thinking back to all of this more historical, sociological, the fancy word for it's the socio-rhetorical style that's going on inside of this. But I'm seeing the humanity of Paul. And that's this piece about Paul that, a lot of times we fail to see, is we don't see Paul the human. We have this idea of Paul being this like theological giant sitting behind a big, huge desk, and we realize that so much of his stuff was heavily relational based. It took years. He's talking about how he never had to take money from people. And a lot of times you hear about support. Well, this is when he's in jail. And, back then when you get thrown in jail, if somebody's not supporting you, you're going to starve to death in there. But you think about just the deep levels of work that Paul had to do as far as relationships are concerned, grow these new Christians. And then to realize that these letters that are going back to these places are talking about the tough theological just work and decision making that they're having to do. And then you've got the Timothys, you've got Philemon, you've got these these really, really, really personal letters that are going on. And I love it because you see the heart of Paul. So instead of this, like the theological giant of Paul, like sitting behind the big, huge desk, like long beard, all that kind of stuff, we realize instead he's a guy who's working on making canopies and tents. Like that's his trade. And you see the cities he goes to, it kind of makes even more sense then. But how heavily relational this work had to be. And then we see that relational work out really deeply, especially with Timothy. But then we see this back and forth with Philemon about Onesimus the slave, where Paul's kind of, he's asking, he's cashing in relational credit and saying, listen, we need to talk about these things. You owe me these things. Let's do these things. And so I'm kind of happy to be on this like second to last day of the shred, thinking about just the humanity of one of the biggest figures of the church and of the Christian world. You know, a lot of people talk about how Paul's Christianity was very different from Jesus's Christianity, and I don't want to dip my toe into that argument because there's some things that I can agree with that. But when I see the humanity of Paul is when I realize just that argument doesn't stand very well across the whole history of Christianity. It might make some sense in the last 15 years, but it doesn't. So that's it. I think I've got one day left on the shred. I know the dates are kind of funky because I didn't do Psalms and that kind of stuff, but I think I got one day left. And so I'll be back with one more video talking about the shred. And then I'm going to wait a few days and I'm going to do a video just kind of wrapping up my whole thoughts and my whole experience about it. So I'm Chad. I'm a pastor in Louisiana. I'm reading the Bible in 30 days and I'm vlogging through it. And I will see you back in the next video.